Alright, I'm going to start with the upper receiver on this high standard. Most of them are going to be identical. First thing I'm going to take out is the extractor. In order to do that, right inside there, you'll see there's a little button. You need to get a very, very tiny screwdriver and stick it between that plunger and the extractor. Once you get it between them, depress the plunger all the way down, and then the extractor will rock right out. Get in between the two, depress that plunger, and then the extractor will rock right out. As you remove the extractor, just make sure you keep your finger over this hole when you pull this screwdriver out to make sure that your plunger and stuff doesn't fly across the room. But take the plunger out, and then inside there is the extractor spring, or extractor plunger spring. And the extractor spring and the firing pin spring on this are both the same. As you can see, it won't fit one way. It will fit the other. The firing pin and firing pin spring in these handguns are the same way. There's a tighter taper on one side of the spring, so when you reassemble these, make sure that the taper on the spring is facing the right direction. Alright, next thing to remove is the firing pin. If you look at the face, the firing pin of course protrudes right there on the rimfire, off to the side instead of in the middle like a center fire. You can actually see it in there. On the inside of the slide, this is the firing pin right here. It is held in place by this roll pin, which you can also see on the inside here. Mention on that, it's sometimes easier to drive it from the top, because then you can just set it down and you've got this distance here for it to get started. I like to use soft wood to work on this if I'm not using a block. I prefer a block of course, but I don't have one handy right now. So use soft wood so that if the pin comes out too far as it strikes the wood, it'll actually pierce the wood rather than damaging the pin. Obviously a roll pin punch would be best for this. I don't have one, so just select an appropriately sized pin punch. Careful to line it up properly so you don't ding up or mar the finish on the gun. Give it a couple of light taps to get started to get it below the surface. And we just tap that pin out. Once it's out so far, I actually like to hold this in my hand to tap it the rest of the way so that the pin falls out in my hand and doesn't get lost. Now one of the tips that I tell people is to put a little dab of silicone grease on the table, and you can put your pins and springs on that silicone grease and it'll keep them from getting lost by bouncing and rolling around. Now release the tension on the firing pin from inside. Just push on a little bit, pull your pin punch out, and then release the firing pin, and your firing pin and firing pin spring should come out. Now if it's been a while since this has been cleaned, it's not going to come out real easy. But if you look on the back of the firing pin, there is one side that has a flat surface on here that you can grab with a screwdriver. If you grab that flat surface with a screwdriver, you can actually work the firing pin out if it doesn't come out just by pulling that pin. Just like that. And there's your firing pin and firing pin spring. And as I mentioned, the firing pin spring has a tighter taper on one end than it does the other. So if you put it on backwards, it'll go beyond the tip of the firing pin. If you put it on correctly, it will stick up above the level of the firing pin. So when you reassemble this, make sure that's on correctly. Okay, Next thing we're going to remove is the recoil spring and recoil spring plunger, which is in the next thing we're going to remove is the recoil spring, which you see right there, and the recoil spring plunger, which is right here. There. They are held in place by this plug, which is held in place by this pin. And this pin, just like the one for the firing pin spring, just taps out. And it'll come out this side, and you can tap it from inside or outside. Either way doesn't matter. Now, in theory, as you're tapping that out, keep your finger over that plug to keep that plug from flying across the room as soon as that pin is out. On this particular handgun, that plug is tight enough that it does not come out easily, and I'll show you a trick for how to get that out. But for anything other than this particular gun, as you remove that pin, keep your finger over this to keep that from flying across the room. Find the appropriate sized pin punch. Couple light taps to get started. There's your pin. And like I said, in theory, as you pull this out, that might take off, but as you can see, mine doesn't. Some guns, that'll just pop right out. The best way to get that out is on the inside of the receiver, on the plunger. Take a very long punch. This is actually an alignment punch, but one that's long enough that you can depress that all the way until it's fully collapsed. Once you have that fully collapsed, rotate it so that that block is free, and then just give that a couple of taps. And see that block is starting to come out. Now what I like to do is tuck that into a plastic bag or into my shirt or something along those lines, so that when it does come out, it doesn't go flying across the room. What I'm going to use here is just a shop rag, just to capture it as it comes out. And there you go. Once you have that out, you now have a complete detail stripped armor's level disassembly on a high standard upper receiver. This is a high standard 22. Most of the high standard target pistols disassemble the same way, but your stripped upper receiver, firing pin spring and roll pin, recoil spring guide, plug and roll pin, extractor plunger and spring, and then the stripped receiver.